Hi everyone, and welcome to a video based around Theme 2's aggregate demand. So what this video will do, it will talk you through this part of the specification that you can now see on your screen. So it's 2.21 all the way down to 2.2.5. Now, a bit like with the other videos, there will be questions. So what I would like you to do, please, as you watch the video, have your independent learning book ready. Jot down the questions that I give you during the video, click pause on the video, write down your answers, and then click play and compare what you've written against what I think the answer should be. Right, so to kick things off, what I would like you to do, please, is to jot down the following two questions. So what is the formula for aggregate demand? And then two, explain the difference between a shift in an aggregate demand and a movement along an AD curve. Right, if you can hit pause, write down your answers, and then click play once you've got those answers down. Right, everyone. Now, this is hopefully what you've been sticking down in your books. Right, so aggregate demand, first of all, it measures the total demand for the goods and services produced by an economy. So aggregate demand is therefore a measurement of the GDP of the economy. Okay, now what we've got to accept is that at a macro level, aggregate demand is all of the different demand for different outputs by different businesses and consumers and governments added together. So the formula for aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So C, or consumption, is household spending on goods and services. So this is you and me buying t-shirts, buying houses, buying cars, buying TVs, eating out in restaurants, etc. It's household demand for goods and services. And it's by far and away the biggest component of aggregate demand. Now, the next one is investment, or I. This is spending by firms on capital goods, so upgrading infrastructure, buying machinery, growing their businesses, etc. Government spending, of course, is spending by the government on goods and services, but also providing welfare support for households as well. So paying people's pensions, unemployment benefits. But then it's about demanding healthcare services for the NHS, education for schools and colleges, etc. Building motorway networks and roads up and down the country. Exports, or X, is foreign demand for UK goods and services. So when we export cars to America or Europe, it's a British export. If French people come on holiday to the UK economy, then they're demanding UK goods and services. And then what we do at the end, we take away the imports, or the M, because this is us demanding foreign goods and services. So this is output that's in our economy, but it wasn't produced here. So you get that withdrawal of cash out of our economy. So imports is not our demand. Well, it's our demand, but it's not our output. It's output produced by different people across the world. Now, if I was to take the imports away from the exports, it would show me the net trade performance. So if the value of exports increases, then you get an increase in aggregate demand. If the value of imports were to increase, you get a reduction in aggregate demand. Right, now look at that diagram on your screen. I've drawn the aggregate demand curve in a fixed place at the moment. Now, what we've got here then is the idea of movements along an aggregate demand curve. If price levels, which is the measurement of inflation, were to increase, there would be a contraction in aggregate demand. And if you think about it logically, it makes perfect sense. If price levels increase, then households will have less ability to buy goods and services. If the cost of machinery and capital becomes more expensive, businesses will invest less into it. Governments will also buy less from the economy if price levels increase due to affordability. But also, you're going to get a falling foreign demand for UK goods and services. And that's because of a reduction in international competitiveness. If our price levels increase, foreigners go, I'm not buying UK goods and services, and our exports would fall. Now, obviously, if price levels increased in our economy, more of us will probably shift our demand away to more attractive imports. Obviously, if price levels fell, then aggregate demand would extend. Lower price levels would stimulate more consumption, more investment, more government spending, more exports, and less imports to take place. Right. Shifting aggregate demand are for non-price reasons. So in other words, if AD was to move outwards from AD1 in this diagram to AD2, it means that either consumption, investment, government spending, or exports have increased for non-price reasons. It could also be driven by a reduction in imports, which is for non-price reasons. Inward shift, well, it's a reduction in aggregate demand for non-price reasons. A lot of these ideas are the same thing that we looked at in theme 1 around supply and demand. Now, in the rest of the presentation, we will explore different reasons why AD might move outwards or why it might move inwards. Quite clearly, what we'd like AD to move outwards because that will stimulate economic growth in the economy and more jobs. If AD moves inwards, then of course it would lead to fall in GDP and then possibly more unemployment within the economy. Right, now we're going to focus next on the C, or the consumption in aggregate demand. So again, what we'd like to do in your books, please write down these two questions. Well, 3, what is consumption? And then 4, outline a range of causes of an increase in consumption. So in other words, for non-price reasons, why might consumption suddenly increase? Once you've put down the questions and the answers, well, I beg your pardon, if you can hit pause now, click play again once you've put down your answers. Right, here we go. Now, what we said before then was that consumption is spending by households on goods and services. And it's by far and away the biggest component of aggregate demand. Now, you've got here some causes of an increase in consumption. So look at the first one I've put down there, disposable incomes. Now, a disposable income is the income that people have left over once they have paid their taxes and once they received their government benefits. Now, if people were to increase or have an increase in disposable income, then it's very likely people will buy more goods and services. Okay, so this could be driven by a reduction in income tax rates, which could lead to more disposable income. It could be an increase in benefits paid by the government to households, which could increase disposable income. It could just be people have been given a pay rise from their employer. So if these things happen, then people have got more disposable income, and that will increase their demand for goods and services. It is worth noting, though, that poorer households generally will consume a bigger proportion of their disposable income than richer households. And the reason for it is richer people have got the luxury of being able to save as well as spend. So with their income, they can satisfy their wants and needs and have spare cash left over. Poorer people don't genuinely have that luxury. So what you tend to find is if the disposable incomes were to increase more for the poor, you're probably going to get a more significant increase in consumption than what you would do if it was a pay rise for richer households. Right, next one is something called the marginal propensity to consume. And this is something that people often struggle with. Now, all the marginal propensity to consume is, as you can read there, it's the proportion of additional income that households choose to spend on consumption. Okay, so let's say, for example, people received a pay rise or had more disposable income. What we're looking at here is what proportion of it would people devote towards buying extra goods and services instead of saving that money. Now, if we were to have in the economy an increase in people's marginal propensity to consume, then what it will mean is that we're going to get a more significant increase in consumption. And we'll think about some ideas in a moment or two which could lead to a growth in marginal propensity to consume. One idea, though, could be a reduction in interest rates. Remember, with your disposable income, you can either spend or save it. If you were to receive additional money and interest rates were very low, then people would rather spend than save that money due to low returns available to saving. And that would lead to an increase in the marginal propensity to consume and therefore increase consumption. So guys, look at that final point there, interest rates. And this ties in wonderfully with the marginal propensity to consume. An interest rate is the percentage cost of borrowing money from banks or from financial institutions but it's also the percentage returns available to savers. If we were to lower interest rates, people would rather or are more likely to spend rather than save their money. But also with low interest rates, people are more likely to borrow from banks due to low repayments. And these things would lead to an increase in consumption. Obviously, if interest rates were to go up, people are more likely to save more of their money and they're also less likely to borrow. And that could lead to a reduction in consumption. Other factors, though, we have something that we call the wealth effect. Now, the wealth effect is simply the stock of money that people own. So this could be savings, it could be property that you own, it could be shares. Now, if we were to see wealth increase, then people become more confident to spend more of their money. So you tend to find that when people's property values increase and they're more wealthy, those people are more likely to consume more in the economy. They feel more confident or happy to spend their disposable income. Now, you also tend to find that if people are more wealthy and their property price increases, then people might be more inclined to want to borrow from banks and then borrow against that wealth that they've now got. And banks are more likely to want to lend to people as well, due to people having more collateral to cover the possibility of people not repaying that money. So as people become more wealthy, more people might borrow big sums of money to buy more property or to buy new cars, etc. And that would lead to an increase in consumption. Now, one other thing, it could just simply be a growth in consumer confidence. Um, and this is linked to what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits. If people believe the economy is performing well and jobs are secure and safe, and they're expecting wage rates to increase and business profits to be growing, people become more confident to spend. So again, you're going to get more consumption because of more confidence. If people worried about a recession and they're worried about their house price falling, so wealth falling, if they were concerned about their job security and future business performance, those people might think, you know what, I would rather save to cover myself if I am to lose my job. And that would lead to a reduction in consumption. The last thing I've put down here is the average propensity to save. So this is the proportion of income that people devote towards saving. So if people start to save more of their money, the assumption would be that must mean that consumption is falling. If, for example, interest rates were to increase, people might think, you know what, I'd rather save rather than spend my money. So that would lead to a reduction in consumption. Right, next thing, we're moving away from consumption now towards investment. So if you can now write down, please, these next two questions. So number 5 is, what is investment? And number 6, outline a range of causes of an increase in investment. Once you've written them down, hit pause and start writing your answers. Once your answers are down, again, hit play. Right, guys, so what is investment? Well, investment, it's like consumption, but for businesses. So this is businesses upgrading their productive capacity. So it's normally linked to capital. So this could be buying or building more infrastructure, buying new machinery. It could be something simple like Domino's Pizza, buying new ovens for their restaurants, buying new delivery vehicles or new tills. Now, obviously, if there's an increase in investment, it would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Now, one thing I want to differentiate between here, though, is the difference between gross investment and net investment. Now, gross investment is simply how much money businesses invest. So, in other words, what is the cost of buying all the additional capital that businesses buy on an annual basis? Now, net investment, though, is a little bit different. What we would do with net investment, we'd take the gross investment, which is how much they spend on new capital, but we take away how much of that is what we call depreciation. Okay, so for example, when firms invest, let's say £1 million, that is not all pure new investment which will expand productive capacity. A certain proportion of it will be factoring in depreciation. In other words, replacing worn out old equipment. So, for example, if Domino's Pizza replace an old worn out delivery vehicle, then that would be gross investment, but it'd be no new net investment. If, for example, they only had one vehicle and they buy two new vehicles, one to replace a worn out one for a new one, then we've got some positive net investment taking place there. Okay, so you're only going to increase your productive capacity if you have got a positive net investment. Okay, so this would mean that you're investing more than the rate of depreciation of your worn out old capital. Okay, so things only improve if firms are investing more than the depreciation of the old worn out equipment and capital in their businesses. Right, so what will affect how much firms are willing to invest into their businesses? Well, first of all, economic growth. If economies are growing and GDP is increasing, then firms are thinking, well, demand for output's growing. Well, firms therefore will need to have a positive net investment. In other words, what they've got to do is to increase their productive capacity to meet growing demand. So if they know that GDP growth is meaning the demand for their outputs increasing, it might mean they've got to increase their productive capacity by buying more capital like machines and factories in order to meet that growing demand. Now, this ties in really, really well with Keynes's view on animal spirits. If firms are confident, they've got positive expectations about the future of the economy, then they will invest more to expand their productive capacity. If, of course, we look at something like COVID-19, firms at the moment have got very, very poor animal spirits, which means investment might be starting to fall for a lot of those firms. Other reasons are interest rates. Firms often have to borrow money to fund investment. Now, what firms have got to consider is what are the returns on making investments? If they've got to pay a high interest rate on borrowing money, then it's more difficult to make profits on those investments that they make. So what you would find then is that when interest rates are low, firms are more likely to borrow from banks to fund more investment to take place. Other ideas could be access to borrowing. So, for example, if banks become more keen to lend to businesses, then it means that businesses are more able to borrow to fund more investment. So that's what we call access to credit. Now, the final one is regulations. Now, regulations are designed to look after people, but what they can sometimes do, they can make it very difficult for businesses to produce. So things like environmental rules means that businesses have got to follow lots of very complex rules to produce goods and services. If we therefore were to reduce the regulations, then businesses become more keen to invest because there's more ability to make profit. Right, we've looked at consumption, we've looked at investment. What we're now looking at is government spending. So what I would now like to think about are the answers to the next two questions. So in your books again, write down these questions, hit pause, write down your answers, and then hit play afterwards. Right, so government spending then, let's think about what it is. Now, government spending generally falls under two different categories. It's funding the public sector, so it's paying for the NHS. It's paying for the emergency services, the police, etc., the fire brigade. It's paying for education, schools and colleges across the country, paying for road networks, transport links that are often paid for out of people's taxes. I would also include, though, subsidies to businesses will come out of government spending, but then we also have what we call welfare support. This could be paying for pensions for those that are retired, but also unemployment benefits for those that currently are out of work but actively seeking work. Now, if we're trying to think about what will affect how much government spending will take place, it's often linked to the business cycle. So if the economy was in a recession when GDP is falling, then what will happen is governments will increase government spending in order to help boost the economy. But also, when you think about it, when the economy is struggling financially and people are unemployed, then there'll be a need for more benefits to be paid out of government spending to look after people. Okay, so you tend to find that when economies aren't doing very well, governments will increase their spending that takes place. Now, obviously, when economies are doing very well, then governments will often reduce government spending, probably to try and improve the finances from overspending when times were not very good in the economy. Now, just a few more key terms to sort of note from this, though. When the level of government spending exceeds the level of taxation, we call this a budget deficit. So governments spend more than what they get back from taxes. Now, if they were to increase their budget deficit, which is more spending or lower taxes, you would get an increase in aggregate demand. If they run a budget surplus, what it will mean is that the level of taxation exceeds the level of government spending. If you increase a budget surplus, it would reduce aggregate demand. Now, there is something that we call here known as the golden rule. And this is the idea that governments should try to avoid building up long-term debt. So, for example, if they run a big budget deficit in a negative output gap in a recession to help grow the economy, then they want to pay back those losses by running a budget surplus when the economy is performing well. When government adjusts government spending and taxation to manipulate aggregate demand, we call it fiscal policy. Okay, so if they want to raise aggregate demand, they would increase government spending and lower taxes. If they wanted to lower aggregate demand, they would lower government spending and they would look to raise taxes that take place. Right, well, we're now going to move on to looking at trade performance, which is the exports minus the imports. So again, in your books, please write down these questions. And then once you've got them down, hit pause, write down your answers. Once you've got your answers down, hit play again, please. Right, guys, now the final part of aggregate demand, so remember, consumption plus investment plus government spending is exports, takeaway, imports. Now, just a few key terms to go through then, first of all. When we import, this is when we buy goods and services that have been made overseas. So it's goods that have been brought into our economy from overseas. This would therefore mean that when we import, money will leave our economy. That will reduce the UK's aggregate demand because the money is leaving the economy. UK exports are when we make output in our economy and then we sell this output overseas. This is good for aggregate demand. It would increase it when exports increase because exports are an injection of money into our economy. So if I wanted to work out our net trade performance, it's where the value of exports are, well, I'll rephrase that. So net trade performance is where you take the value of exports and you minus the value of imports. Now, if we had a trade surplus, what it would mean is that the value of our exports exceed the value of our imports. If you've got a growth in your trade surplus, that would increase aggregate demand. A trade deficit is where the value of imports exceeds the value of exports. Now, if this happens and if it increases, it would reduce aggregate demand in the economy. So to increase aggregate demand, you want more exports and you want fewer imports. Now, we've got to think about what will affect importing and exporting taking place. Now, first of all, in the UK, if we were to see a growth in real incomes, then British people will generally buy more imports. So if real incomes increase, more of us will buy more normal and luxury goods, which means we buy more foreign goods and services. So foreign cars, TVs, foreign holidays, etc. So what you might take out of that, then if real incomes were to fall, UK people would buy fewer imported goods and services. Now, you've then got currency appreciation and depreciation. I'm going to talk through exchange rate theory at the end of this video. So hold your thoughts on that one. Right, now you've got here other influences on our trade performance. So if we were trying to think about what will affect exports from the UK economy, the state of the world economy is a really, really important thing to consider. If the global economy is struggling financially, it means that real incomes across the world are falling. That would probably reduce the demand across the world for British exports. Okay, and this is how problems in one part of the world can create issues in other countries across the world. It's what we call an external shock. So if incomes are falling in America and Europe, etc., that would lower the demand for UK goods and services. That would therefore lower our exports and lower aggregate demand. So if the global economy is performing really well and their incomes are growing, it would probably lead to an increase in the demand for UK exports and therefore increase our aggregate demand as well. Now, the next one is something we call protectionism. This is where other economies across the world might put barriers in place to stop us selling our goods and services in their economies. So they might, for example, put taxes on UK goods and services. They might give their own businesses subsidies, which makes their products cheaper in their economy. Now, if other economies across the world use more protectionism against us, it would lower our exports and therefore lower aggregate demand. If other countries across the world open up and reduce protectionism, then it allows us to export more of our products across the world. Now, another factor could be non-price factors. And what I'm generally focusing on here is quality. If the quality of UK output was to increase, then it would raise the demand for our goods across the world. People want good quality. If we can produce better products than anyone else, then ultimately more people will buy UK exports. Now, the next one is commodities. Now, what we're looking here, what we call simple products. So we're looking at land-based resources, so food, oil, fossil fuels, that type of thing. If we export more of these, then it would increase aggregate demand. If we import more of these, then it would lower our aggregate demand. Now, a final one is linked to productivity, or what we call international competitiveness. If we can find ways of making output more efficient in our economy, then ultimately it means that more people want to buy our now more competitively priced goods and services from our economy. Right, what I said I would end was on exchange rate theory. Right, okay, now if we were to look at an exchange rate first of all, it's where we look at the value of one currency in terms of another currency. And what we can have is either a currency appreciation or a currency depreciation. Now, I'm going to take the assumption that we start off by assuming that £1 is equal to $1. What we're now going to do is to appreciate the currency, which means that £1 is now worth $2. Now, at the bottom of the page, you'll see the acronym SPICED. Strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. If the currency or our currency gets stronger, it means that our imports are now cheaper to buy. And look at the example to work it out. If we used to buy a $1 import into our country, at the original exchange rate, it would cost £1 to buy. Under the new exchange rate of £1 equals $2, that $1 import will now only cost 50p. So that means the imports have become cheaper for people in Britain to buy. So a currency appreciation would raise the demand for imports into the country. Now, on top of that, then, our exports would become more expensive for people across the world to buy. And again, look at the data to help you. An American person buying a £1 British good used to pay $1 to buy it. To buy that £1 product now, it's going to cost them $2. This therefore means then that when exports become more expensive, our exports are now less competitive, and there'll be a reduction in the demand for our exports across the world. This therefore means then that if imports become cheaper, we buy more imports. If exports become dearer, we export less. This would worsen our trade performance. So more imports, fewer exports would reduce aggregate demand from our economy. Currency depreciation, though, is a little bit different. Now, a currency depreciation is where the value of our currency falls against another currency. So this time we're going to go from a situation where £1 was worth $1 to a situation where £1 is only worth 50 cents. Now, what the acronym WIPI now shows us at the bottom of the page is that when the pound becomes weaker, imports become dearer and exports become cheaper. And think about why. When we were importing a $1 good into Britain before, it used to cost £1. Problem now is £1 will only buy 50 cents. So to buy a $1 good now will now cost £2. So imports are now more expensive. This would lead to a reduction in import demand. Exports are now cheaper. So, for example, a £1 British good used to cost $1 for an American person to buy. That £1 good now will only cost 50 cents. So exports are cheaper, so export demand will increase. Now, what will happen now then is our net trade performance will improve. So because our imports are now more expensive, import demand will fall. Cheaper exports, export demand will increase. If we're exporting more and importing less, this would lead to an improvement in net trade performance and therefore increase aggregate demand. Right, guys, there you go. That is the end of the video. Thank you very much.